The room had been laughing. Crystal glasses collided like small explosions, silver forks clicked, and the chandeliers scattered fragments of light over polished faces. At the far edge of the table, someone rose with a smirk, his words dripping down like spilled wine. Laughter followed, shallow, obedient, cruel. She stood still, tray balanced, eyes lowered, body invisible. That was her role, to move quietly, to vanish behind each toast, to serve without being seen. Yet, in that instant, something broke. The sound came first, not the laughter, not the mocking tone, but her voice. Clear, sharp, rolling in syllables no one in that room expected. A language foreign to them, yet spoken with the ease of a native. The laughter stuttered. Knives froze against plates. Eyes darted, uncertain whether to dismiss or listen. For the first time that night, silence had weight, thick and unbearable, and at the center of it, she stood no longer invisible, no longer erased. What happens when the quietest person in the room speaks the loudest truth? The hotel was built like a monument to power. Its glass walls reflected the city's skyline, a mirror of ambitions stretching upward into a night, thick with neon and exhaust. Inside, chandeliers spilled manufactured daylight across marbled floors, their light designed not to illuminate but to blind. Every corner smelled of well-aged wine, polished wood, perfumes too heavy to breathe without remembering the price tag. The dinner had been planned for months. Invitations were never mailed, only whispered from one power to another. A private chain of influence deciding who was worthy of stepping into the ballroom. Beneath the golden arches, no one came hungry. They came to be seen, to be remembered, to secure alliances that money alone could not buy. Every detail existed to reinforce hierarchy. Tables draped in ivory linen, silver cutlery engraved with insignias, centerpieces of roses imported from another continent, flown overnight only, to wilt under artificial light. Even the seating chart was a map of power. Closer to the head of the table meant closer to influence. Further down meant you were tolerated but never embraced. Yet among all this display, silence lived in plain sight. It wore uniforms of black and white, pressed fabric stretched across weary shoulders. It carried trays that trembled under the weight of crystal glasses. It moved quickly, apologetically, always stepping aside when laughter grew too loud. The waitstaff were ghosts in their own bodies. They floated between tables, filling glasses without acknowledgement, clearing plates without thanks. Their hands worked with mechanical precision, but their presence dissolved as soon as the wine touched the lips of those they served. They were the invisible current that kept the dinner flowing, never allowed to be the storm. And like all storms suppressed, too long, tension was building. There was a rhythm to the prejudice here, subtle yet suffocating. Every ignored gesture, every glance that slid past without recognition, every command, disguised as courtesy, reinforced the invisible wall dividing the room. Wealth and whiteness sat at the table. Brown and black hands held the trays. No one said, it allowed no one needed to. The system spoke through silence. At the head of the table sat the evening's sun, the billionaire CEO. His wealth glowed in the cut of his suit, in the way every laugh bent toward him, in the silence that followed his smallest gesture. He was not just a man in the room. He was the axis around which the room turned. His words carried the gravity of unspoken law, his approval a currency more valuable than gold. The others, dressed in shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos, orbited him carefully. Each smile was an investment, each laugh at his jokes an offering. They performed admiration like ritual, desperate not to slip from his circle of light. But light does not reveal everything. Light blinds, it casts shadows deeper than night. In those shadows stood the waitress. Her uniform matched the others, yet somehow weighed heavier. Each movement of her body was deliberate, cautious, designed to keep her unseen. Her eyes never lingered long. Her voice rarely rose above a whisper. Her posture folded inward as though trying to erase herself. The ballroom saw trays, not the person carrying them. Glasses, not the hands steadying them. Service, not humanity. Still, beneath that silence, a secret lived. It sat in her chest like a flame smothered by years of smoke, flickering but never extinguished. It was knowledge, a gift honed in hours no one had witnessed, a language she had carried with her, soft as memory, sharp as truth. The night pressed forward, a performance of power disguised as dining, speeches spilled like wine, indulgent and heavy. Toasts rang out, crystal glasses clashing like weapons, in a war fought with wealth. The air thickened with smoke and arrogance. With the sound of laughter that swallowed smaller voices whole, each clink of glass became a bell tolling in her ears. It was the sound of invisibility, the reminder that she was not meant to exist in the narrative unfolding around her. And yet, she did. She felt it in her bones, the weight of every ignored life in rooms like these, the centuries of service, the generations of silence forced upon people who looked like her. She was both one woman and every woman who had been, erased by chandeliers, their brilliance reflecting only the faces of the powerful. The hotel's walls held their secrets well. They absorbed slurs disguised as jokes, smirks masquerading as charm, commands coated in politeness sharp enough to cut. These walls had heard it all before. They had contained countless nights of subtle cruelty wrapped in gold. Tonight was no different, yet it would be, because nights like these, where arrogance grew unchecked and silence was demanded, were also the nights where silence sometimes broke. And when silence breaks, it does not whisper, it shatters. The dinner stretched into its own eternity. Servers moved, guests laughed, the CEO's voice rose and fell like a tide that no one dared interrupt. And somewhere within that tide, a single moment waited, a moment when the invisible would speak. The prologue was not in her words, but in the silence that had prepared the room for them. Silence was the stage, polished and cruel, and all it needed was one fracture. That fracture was coming. Mornings began before the sun. The city was still half asleep when her alarm cut through the silence, a shrill reminder that rest was a privilege she could not afford. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if each gesture needed to be preserved, because the day ahead would demand every ounce of energy she could spare. The apartment was small, a single room carved into a larger building where walls were thin and ceilings too low. The paint peeled in corners, the faucet dripped without pause, and the heater wheezed like an old man unwilling to work. Yet she treated it like sanctuary. Here, she could breathe without measuring her tone. Here, she was not invisible, was simply alone. She dressed in her uniform carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles as if it were armor. The fabric was stiff, colorless, designed to make her fade into the background of wherever she worked. She ironed it nightly, even when exhaustion tempted her otherwise. Presentation mattered, not because anyone thanked her for it, but because the smallest flaw invited judgment. A wrinkle was laziness, a loose thread, incompetence. In a world where she was already fighting to be seen as worthy, she could not afford another mark against her. Her mornings held rituals of survival. Coffee she could barely afford but needed to feel awake. A notebook worn thin by years of use, filled with phrases in different languages, Japanese characters, French verbs, Spanish idioms, each page carrying the weight of a dream she wasn't sure she'd ever touch. She studied in the quiet before dawn, when her mind was sharpest, and the world had not yet reminded her of her place. By 7, she was out the door, walking briskly to the bus stop. The air smelled of asphalt and fried food, remnants of the night before. Commuters shuffled past her, eyes glazed, headphones in. No one looked twice. She preferred it that way. Being ignored on the street was safer than being noticed. The hotel loomed across the skyline by the time she arrived, its mirrored glass reflecting the rising sun. It looked like a promise she had never been offered, a palace for those who measured worth in billions. She passed through the employee entrance, a narrow door tucked behind the loading dock where delivery trucks exhaled fumes. The difference between guests and staff began at that threshold. Guests entered through golden arches, staff entered through steel doors. The employee locker room was dim and cramped, lined with metal lockers painted a dull gray. Her co-workers filtered in one by one, voices low, bodies weary. They greeted each other in murmurs, a fellowship built on shared exhaustion. She exchanged nods, but little else. Bonds were hard to form when everyone knew turnover was constant. The hotel devoured workers as easily as it welcomed guests. Her supervisor handed out assignments with a clipped tone. Banquet service tonight, the CEO's dinner. A small flicker of anxiety pressed at her ribs, but she swallowed it. It wasn't her first elite event. She knew the rhythm. Serve, smile, vanish. Still, she could feel the weight of the evening ahead. Rooms like that magnified everything, every misstep, every second too slow, every accidental glance too long. Work began in the kitchen, where the air was thick with steam and the clang of pots. Chefs barked orders over the hiss of boiling water. Plates were assembled like currency, each detail arranged for maximum display. She balanced trays, polished glasses, memorized placements, hours blurred into motion, and by the time the ballroom doors opened, her body already ached. The dinner was a world apart. Chandeliers burned like suns overhead, blinding her eyes after the dim corridors. Tables stretched endlessly, covered in white linen that glowed under the light. Guests flowed in like royalty, dripping wealth in diamonds, watches, and laughter. The air was perfumed with excess. She moved silently between tables, offering wine, refilling water, clearing plates with practiced grace. Every gesture was designed to erase herself. No eye contact unless necessary, no words beyond the script, sparkling or still. "May I take this for you?" It was a role rehearsed so well it no longer required thought. She had become fluent in invisibility, but invisibility carried its own sting. She noticed it in the way eyes slid past her as though she were part of the furniture, in the way conversations hushed when she drew too near, as if her presence contaminated their secrets, in the way a guest once set his empty glass on her tray without looking, still talking, as though a machine had taken it from him, not a human hand. Each microaggression landed softly but left bruises nonetheless. A smile ignored, a request barked without courtesy, a laugh that lingered a little too long when she stumbled slightly, catching herself before the glasses toppled. None of it was enough to call cruelty, yet all of it combined into something heavier than malice, erasure. What she carried inside was heavier still. Every night, when her body collapsed onto her bed, she opened her notebook and turned pages like they were doors to another life. She wrote in Japanese, sentences that felt like music on her tongue. She remembered the hours spent online, learning from strangers who didn't know her face, who only knew her hunger to understand. Language had been her rebellion, her quiet protest against a world that wanted her small, in a tongue not her own. She felt powerful, yet she told no one. To reveal that secret in this world would only invite disbelief, mockery, or worse, dismissal. A waitress fluent in Japanese, they would laugh before the words even reached their ears. And so, she carried it like contraband, hidden in the folds of her heart. The CEO's dinner was not her first encounter with him. She had served at his table before, watched him from the edges of vision. His presence was magnetic and suffocating, drawing everyone toward him while pressing down on those who had no place in his orbit. He was the kind of man who demanded attention without asking for it, whose approval was treated like currency. She had heard the way others laughed at his jokes before he finished them, had seen the way even seasoned politicians bent themselves toward his favor. What unsettled her most was not his power, but his ease in using it. He did not need to sneer or shout. His arrogance was casual, woven into every gesture. The world bent for him, and he did not even notice the bending. As she polished another glass, preparing for the evening, she caught her reflection in the surface. It warped her face, stretched it, made it look smaller than it was. She thought of mirrors, of how they always showed the surface but never the depth. She wondered if that was how the world saw her, a reflection, not a person. The day crawled into evening. Guests filled the ballroom, and the noise rose like a tide. Toasts rang out, each one louder, emptier than the last. She moved among them like a shadow, balancing trays that felt heavier with every step. Her feet throbbed, her shoulders ached, but she did not falter. Service demanded perfection, and perfection demanded silence. Still, beneath her calm exterior, the flame flickered. She felt it every time the CEO's laughter filled the room, every time a guest looked through her, every time a glass clinked against another. It whispered to her, "You are not invisible. You are not what they think you are." The whisper grew louder as the night deepened. Somewhere between the second course and the dessert, as the air thickened with arrogance and smoke, she felt the tension coiling inside her. A breaking point lingered, close but unseen, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. And storms, once born, cannot be ignored. The dinner began like every other, but the air was heavier. Even as she moved through the ballroom with steady precision, there was a sharpness in the way eyes cut across the room, a quiet calculation behind every laugh. Deals were being brokered in glances. Alliances were born and buried in the curve of a smile. Power was not only at the table, was the table. She carried her tray with practiced grace, the glasses aligned like soldiers awaiting inspection. The silver shone too brightly, reflecting faces that never looked back at her. She delivered drinks, collected plates, and slipped unnoticed between chairs. Each step was perfect, yet invisibility weighed on her like chains. The billionaire CEO commanded the evening. His voice rose above the hum, coated in confidence, punctuated by the indulgent laughter of those eager to be noticed. He was not just the loudest presence, he was the gravitational pull that determined the orbit of everyone else. His stories, exaggerated yet unquestioned, painted him as a man untouchable, inevitable. Every nod around the table was an act of worship disguised as agreement. And still, no one saw the servers. She bent to clear a plate, careful not to let her arm brush against the silk sleeve of a guest's gown. The woman did not acknowledge her. Instead, she leaned closer to her companion, whispering about investments as though the hands lifting her discarded food did not exist. Another guest waved impatiently, snapping fingers without a glance, as if commanding an object, not a human being. The waitress felt each dismissal as a pinprick, small but relentless. Alone, they were bearable. Together, they were suffocating. As the courses continued, the room grew louder. Wine loosened tongues, arrogance sharpened edges, jokes slipped into cruelty, cloaked in laughter thick enough to hide intent. A man at the far end of the table imitated an accent, drawing out syllables with exaggerated mockery. The group around him roared with laughter. The sound spread like fire until it reached the COO, who rewarded it with a smile that sealed its acceptance. She froze for a moment, tray balanced against her palm, the sound drilling into her chest. It was not directed at her specifically, but it did not need to be. She had heard that tone before, felt it carve her identity into something smaller, something laughable. She kept moving, her face expressionless, her body an instrument of silence, but inside, the flame burned hotter. Later, she returned with a fresh bottle of wine. As she poured, a guest leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking over her with a smirk that lingered too long. He whispered something to the man beside him. Both laughed. Neither spoke to her directly. She placed the bottle gently on the table and stepped away, her back straight, her hands steady though her pulse raced. These were not screams or blows. They were worse in their subtlety. Cruelty that pretended it did not exist. Humiliation that lived in the space between words, in glances that refused to see her humanity. This was the kind of violence that left no bruises but carved deep scars. And above it all, the CEO thrived. He told stories about global markets, about dinners with prime ministers, about luxury retreats where even the air was filtered for purity. The room laughed, applauded, leaned closer. He was the sun, and everyone was desperate for warmth. But she noticed what they did not. When the Japanese investors entered, quiet and reserved, their words clipped and careful, the CEO's arrogance did not shift. He spoke louder, slower, as though volume could bridge the gap between ignorance and understanding. He gestured broadly, his tone bordering on condescension. He never paused to consider that respect might be earned through listening, not performance. The investors nodded politely, their eyes betraying little, yet she saw at the flicker of discomfort, the slight downturn of lips, the glance exchanged between them when his pronunciation faltered. No one else seemed to notice. Or perhaps no one cared. Her hands trembled once as she adjusted her tray. Not from weakness, but from the pull of a secret she carried. A truth pressing against the walls of her silence. The evening dragged forward, each toast louder than the last. Laughter echoed like a storm breaking glass. She felt the weight of every second, every step, every moment of erasure. She thought of the notebook on her nightstand, the words she practiced until exhaustion blurred the ink. She thought of the voices online that had guided her when no one in this world believed she could learn. She thought of how those syllables had become her strength, her rebellion, her proof. And still, she remained silent. But silence has limits. Near the end of the meal, when the air was thick with smoke and wine, the CEO leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying easily above the room. He made a remark not cruel in its sharpness, but devastating in its casualness. He gestured toward the servers, toward the uniforms that blended into the shadows. He called them necessary, like furniture, like the plates that carried food but never tasted it. Laughter followed, obedient and easy. Her stomach tightened. The words hung in the air like poison. She moved quickly, collecting glasses, her face neutral. Inside, though, the flame roared. Another moment, another wound, another weight pressing against the cage of her silence. She looked at the Japanese investors once more. Their patience seemed endless. their expressions unreadable. Yet, when the CEO mispronounced another word, twisting it into something unrecognizable, she saw their restraint crack for just a second. A breath too sharp, an eye flickering downward. They would not correct him. No one would. To do so would break the unspoken order of the room. But the order was already breaking inside her, as she placed another glass on the table. Her hand hovered, for just a moment longer than it should have. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface, smaller, thinner, almost fading into nothing, but not gone, not yet. The night pressed forward, louder, sharper, crueler. Every second felt like a countdown. Every clink of glass was a drumbeat pulling her toward the inevitable. When silence breaks, it is not with a whisper, it is with a fracture so sharp it cannot be ignored, and that fracture was near. The room had grown restless. The wine was nearly gone, the deals nearly spoken, the laughter worn thin but still echoing like ghosts trapped in chandeliers. The billionaire CEO's voice carried louder than the rest, swollen with pride, pushing against the air like an iron fist in a velvet glove. He raised his glass one last time. "The power," he said, smirking. "The kind of power that doesn't wait for permission." The table erupted in applause. Silver cutlery clattered against crystal. The investors raised their glasses politely, their eyes heavy with caution. The waitress moved through the noise like a shadow. The tray in her hands was steady, though her pulse thundered in her throat. She collected plates, replaced glasses, bowed her head. Every motion was perfect, invisible, but beneath the uniform, the silence she had worn all night was splitting at its seams. And then, it happened. The CEO gestured toward her as she set down another glass. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. "See," he said, chuckling, "that's the problem. Some people are born to serve. Furniture, with hands. They'll never speak at the table, only clean it." Laughter exploded around him, eager, sycophantic. It echoed off the walls like a whip cracking skin. Her breath caught. For a moment, her body refused to move. The glass in her hand trembled. She set it down carefully, too carefully, as though the act itself might shatter her. She looked at him, really looked at him. The billionaire smirked, satisfied with the laughter that trailed after him like dogs at his heels. He reached for his glass again, certain the world belonged to him. And then, softly, she spoke. "You pronounced it wrong." The laughter faltered, collapsing into uneasy silence. Forks hovered mid-air. Heads turned slowly, searching for the source. The CEO froze, his smirk twitching into disbelief. "What did you say?" Her voice was steady now, though her heart pounded. "The word, you pronounced it wrong." The Japanese investors stiffened. Their eyes flickered toward her, wide but unreadable. The CEO chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Cute the help thinks she's a teacher now." Her tray lowered to her side. Her eyes locked with his. No longer avoiding. No longer shrinking. Not cute, correct. And then, before anyone could stop her, she spoke. Fluent, sharp, flawless. A stream of Japanese rolled off her tongue, smooth and unbroken. The syllables cut cleanly through the silence, striking the air like thunder. Not a stumble, not a hesitation. Every word exact, every tone precise. The investors straightened, stunned. Their polite composure fractured into something of surprise, recognition, respect. The CEO's smirk collapsed. What did you just say?" One of the investors leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "She said your entire pitch was incoherent, offensive." The other nodded, adding in English, "and that you should listen more than you talk." A ripple moved across the table. The power in the room shifted, tilting like a table with one broken leg. For the first time all night, the CEO's voice did not command the air. The waitress stepped forward, shoulders squared, the weight of years of silence falling away with every word. She spoke again, this time alternating between Japanese and English, her voice rising stronger, sharper. "You mocked us, you mocked me, you mocked every person you think is invisible. But invisibility does not mean ignorance. Furniture doesn't learn languages in the dark. Furniture doesn't bleed when you cut it. Furniture doesn't fight back." Her words struck like blows. The CEO's face twisted, red creeping up his neck. "You don't know your place." She met his gaze without flinching. "I've always known my place. You just never imagined it could be higher than yours." Gasps rippled across the table. The investors exchanged glances, their restraint gone, their approval barely hidden now. For the first time, their nods were not directed at him but at her. The billionaire slammed his fist on the table. Glasses rattled, liquid spilled. Enough, you're a waitress. Nothing more. She lifted her chin. Tonight, maybe, tomorrow, I'll be more than you could ever imagine, and you'll still be the man who mistook silence for stupidity. The words hung heavy in the room. No one laughed. No one applauded. The silence was deeper than any that had come before, thick with the weight of humiliation, his not hers. The CEO's voice cracked, desperate now. You think they'll take you seriously. You think, but he stopped, because the investors were already standing. Bowing to her, the CEO's breath faltered. His empire, his deal, his illusion of untouchable power, it was crumbling right there at the table. And for the first time in his life, he looked small. The waitress placed her tray gently on the table. No trembling, no hesitation. She bowed slightly to the investors. Her words deliberate. Respect, she said softly, is the only real currency. And then she walked away, leaving the laughter, the power, the man who had called her nothing. In the ruins of his own arrogance, the fracture had come, and it had swallowed him whole. The door to the private dining room swung shut behind her, but the silence she left behind didn't dissolve. It hardened, heavy, unbearable. The billionaire CEO sat rigid at the head of the table, face red, eyes darting, chest heaving. The investors, quiet men in tailored suits, were no longer looking at him. Their gazes tracked the waitress's retreat, their eyes shining with something he couldn't command. Respect. One of them cleared his throat. Your arrogance dishonors this room, he said softly, in Japanese. The CEO didn't understand, but he understood enough. For the first time in his career, he felt the ground shifting under his feet, and he had no words to stop it. She walked quickly through the service hall, apron untied, tray pressed against her chest like armor. Her co-workers stared as she passed, whispers snapping in her wake. They had seen her break the unspoken law. Stay silent, stay small, stay invisible. One of the busboys whispered, "What did you do?" Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "I told the truth." She left through the back door, into the night air. The city lights blinked like indifferent stars, and her breath clouded in the cool darkness. She thought it was over, that she had survived. It wasn single quotes T inside. The table fractured. The Japanese investors pushed back their chairs, their decision already forming between them. "We cannot proceed," one said flatly. The CEO's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious. This deal is worth billions." "It is worth nothing without honor," came the reply. His empire trembled in that instant. A $3.5 billion deal, months of planning, countless hours of strategy, all evaporating with the smoke of a single insult. But humiliation never stays contained by mourning. Whispers had reached the press. A story leaked. Billionaire CEO humiliates waitress during investor dinner. At first, it was just a headline, buried beneath stock numbers and election scandals. But then another headline came, then another dot, and then came the video. A phone recording, shaky but clear, captured her voice. The exact moment she spoke flawless Japanese. The exact moment his smirk faltered. The exact moment the power shifted. It spread like wildfire. The waitress's name, once a whisper stitched to an order pad, was now everywhere. And the CEO's name, tarnished. He tried to spin it, of course. Statements drafted overnight. Misunderstanding, taken out of context. He values diversity, but the internet wasn't forgiving. Screenshots of his past surfaced, tweets, interviews were. His arrogance bled through. Old lawsuits dug out of archives. Each detail sharpened into a blade, each blade turned against him. For days, reporters camped outside the restaurant. Cameras flashed like lightning storms, their lenses desperate to catch the girl who had embarrassed a billionaire. She didn't speak, not at first. She slipped through side doors, hid in shadows, disappeared after her shifts, but the silence became another prison, a familiar cage. Until one night, she sat in her tiny apartment, the glow of her cracked phone lighting her face. She scrolled through the endless stream articles, tweets, strangers calling her a hero, and then she saw it, a message from one of the Japanese investors, short, simple. "You deserve to be heard. Do not let him own the story." Her chest tightened, her hands trembled. For the first time in years, she didn't just feel the weight of invisibility, she felt the edge of possibility. The next day, she spoke. Her voice shook at first, addressing the microphones outside the restaurant. But soon, it steadied. She told them what happened, the jokes, the dismissal, the humiliation, and then she told them the truth she had carried for years. I learned Japanese because I wanted to build bridges, because I believed respect crosses every border, every language, but respect only exists when people are willing to see it. He didn't see me. He never saw any of us. Tonight, the world did. The clip went viral, again. He wasn't a man who lost quietly. His lawyers circled her like vultures, letters arriving at her door. Defamation, breach of contract, confidentiality. But every time he struck, the backlash grew louder. Hashtags trended. Sue me too. Respect over power. Lawyers volunteered to defend her for free. Activists marched. Celebrities tweeted her words. The more he attacked, the weaker he looked. The world wasn't buying his story anymore. But power doesn't vanish overnight. He still had connections, allies, enablers. Quiet hands moved behind the scenes, whispering threats. A coworker warned her that men like him don't forgive. And yet, the fear didn't break her this time. It sharpened her. 1 week later, she was invited back to a room like the one where it all began. Not a restaurant now, but a boardroom. Sleek, towering glass windows overlooking the city, that the Japanese investors sat across from her. We were impressed, one said. Not only by your language, but by your courage. You understand respect. You understand silence, and when to break it. That is a rare skill. She blinked, uncertain. I was just doing what anyone should have done. They shook their heads. No. Most stay silent. And then they offered her something unimaginable, a position, consultant, cultural liaison, a bridge between worlds, a role she had once dreamed of in secret, when she buried her textbooks under pillows to study after double shifts. Tears stung her eyes. For the first time, the life she thought was forever out of reach was within her grasp. Meanwhile, the billionaire unraveled. The deal was dead. Stock prices wavered. Investors pulled out. Articles dissected his arrogance, his downfall, his refusal to adapt. Cameras, once desperate for his approval, now stalked him for his humiliation. Every question was about her. Every headline a dagger. And when asked if he regretted his words, he could only stammer. His certainty, his weapon, had abandoned him. For a man who built an empire on fear and dominance, nothing cut deeper than irrelevance. She kept the tray from that night, bent slightly at one corner, faint ring marks staining the surface. To her, it wasn't just a piece of metal anymore, it was a symbol. She hung it on the wall of her apartment, above the desk where she now studied proposals and contracts. Every time she looked at it, she remembered the weight of silence, the moment it cracked, and the truth that spilled out. A reminder, a promise. Respect is the only real currency. The story had stretched beyond one table, one man, one night. It had become a mirror for everyone watching of how easily power mocks, and how quickly it can crumble when truth is spoken. But the war wasn't over, not yet, because men like him don't fall quietly. They claw, they strike, they drag others down with them. And though she had risen, though the world seemed to stand with her, shadows still moved, waiting for the chance to silence her again. The city never truly slept, but tonight its noise felt sharper. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Headlines scrolled across screens and bar windows, and her name flickered again and again on every feed. She sat in the back of a cab, staring at her phone. Another article. Another headline. CEO strikes back, files $50 million lawsuit against Waitress. Her stomach tightened. 50 million. The number wasn't real, it was theater. It was intimidation wrapped in legal ink. But it was meant to bury her, to remind her that the scales of power could still tip against her. She whispered to herself, "Respect is the only real currency." She repeated it like armor. But tonight, that armor felt thin. The lawsuit wasn't his only move. He called for a press conference, flashing lights, cameras lining the steps of his corporate headquarters. He walked out flanked by lawyers, polished as ever, suit pressed, smile forced but sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice booming across microphones. "In recent days, lies have been spread about me, about my company. A misunderstanding has been twisted into slander. I will not be silent while my reputation is destroyed." He turned his gaze directly to the cameras, eyes cold. "This young woman is being used. She is a pawn. She is chasing attention, and I will fight this attack with everything I have." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A pawn, a liar, an attention seeker. He had thrown his final card. Discredit her. reduce her, break her. Reporters shouted questions. Flashbulbs exploded. His lawyers shuffled him away, but the damage was already done. His words traveled faster than any truth. By the time she saw the broadcast, her phone was drowning in messages, some supportive, others vicious, strangers calling her a fraud, a gold digger. Worst, her chest tightened until she could hardly breathe. She sat in her apartment, staring at the tray on her wall. The metal caught the dim light, its scratches whispering memory. She wanted to hide, to vanish, to let the noise swallow itself. But then she remembered the voices, people in marches holding signs with her name, students quoting her words in classrooms, workers writing to her, saying, "You gave me courage to speak." If she hid now, what would that mean? That he was right, that respect wasn't real. Her phone buzzed. A message from the Japanese investors. "Have the floor tomorrow. Use it." Her throat tightened. Tomorrow, a shareholders' meeting. Cameras everywhere. A stage not meant for her, but now offered to her. She closed her eyes, heart pounding. The choice was clear. She couldn't run. Not anymore. The next day, the boardroom wasn't just a boardroom, it was an arena. Shareholders, reporters, employees, cameras broadcasting live to millions. At the center, the CEO sat at the long table, jaw tight, fists clenched. His empire trembled, and this meeting was his last stand. She entered quietly, escorted by the investors. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some clapped softly, others only stared. He sneered when he saw her. "You don't belong here." Her heart thundered, but her voice held. "Neither does disrespect." The room stilled. She stepped forward. "This isn't about money. It isn't about contracts. It's about dignity, about how people are treated when no one is watching." And last week, the world watched. He laughed bitterly. "You think one dinner, one word, changes anything? I built this company. I built everything you see here. People don't care about respect, they care about profit." But the investors' faces told another story. Profit wasn't all they cared about anymore. Reputation mattered, integrity mattered. She looked directly at him. "You built an empire on fear. I built nothing. I had nothing. But fear doesn't last. Respect does." The words struck like thunder. The CEO slammed his fist on the table, rage spilling unchecked. "You're nothing," he shouted. "A waitress, a nobody. Without me, no one would even know your name." The words echoed across the hall, microphones capturing every syllable, cameras broadcasting them to millions. And in that instant, his mask shattered. Because the world didn't see power anymore. They saw desperation. They saw a man unraveling, clinging to dominance that no longer belonged to him. Reporters scribbled furiously. Shareholders shifted uncomfortably. His lawyers buried their faces in their hands. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply said, "You just proved my point." The meeting ended not with applause, but with silence heavy, undeniable. The investors announced their decisions swiftly. The deal was permanently terminated. Stockholders whispered about leadership changes. Reporters swarmed with questions, not for her, but for him. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire CEO had no answers. He stormed out, face pale, cameras trailing, the world watching, his empire crumble in real time. As the room emptied, she stood alone at the podium. The lights were blinding, but her fear had burned away. She spoke one last time. Her words simple, steady, carried across every screen. "Power without respect is nothing." Remember that. The world listened. That night, she returned home. The tray was still there, gleaming faintly in the shadows. She touched it lightly, not as a wound, but as a reminder. She wasn't invisible anymore. And he had thought his badge of wealth, his title, his empire made him untouchable. But the truth had found him, and the truth always does.